Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second talk of the series Inner and Outer Peace. And tonight we are going to try to answer the question, do ideas change the world? There are a lot of people, certainly including idealists, who believe that if there are new elections and a new parliament or a new president is elected, that the country is getting better. Of course, only if the candidate you voted for gets the majority of the votes. The hope for change lies in a new president or in different government or new political leaders. But are those in power, kings and presidents, really that powerful? Do they really determine what happens in the world, what the world looks like, and if there is war or peace, prosperity or poverty? I don't think so. And whether such a president was democratically elected or came to power through a brutal putsch, and the former, of course, is far preferable, basically he is powerless if the population does not accept him or her. Of course, if a president has means of power, armed agents or military, then he can enforce certain measures, but actually that shows his weakness. Because at the moment those means of power disappear, his authority disappears as well. So he does not determine what happens, he only suppresses certain wishes and ideas of the people he leads. And as soon as those means of power slacken, his policies also disappear. So it's the people, the population, who ultimately, and certainly in the long term, determines what happens in a country. Because only when a ruler has the support of the people, he can truly rule. Please don't get me wrong, this is certainly not a plea for indifference to political leaders. My only point is that if the will of the people does not match to that of the political leader, the latter will always lose, at least in the long run. The people rule, and what the people want depends on how they think. And therefore, it is thoughts, ideas that rule the world. A statement that is found in several places in Plato's work and that have been quoted by many. It is this statement, ideals rule the world, that we are going to explore tonight. And it is, especially in the context of inner and outer peace, of the utmost importance. Now, in order to make this statement somewhat plausible for ourselves, we will begin by limiting it to a single human being who rules an individual human being. That may sound a little bit silly, but I mean, what drives a human being? Why do human beings act the way they act? Why does one person like to make a lot of money? And why does another think making a lot of money is totally unimportant? And the answer to the question is not so difficult. What a person wants has everything to do with what he thinks, what their thoughts are, what ideas one has about life. What are the ideals they hold? If somebody thinks that only luxury brings happiness, he wants to earn a lot of money and undertakes what is necessary for that. Thus, on the other hand, one believes that spiritual development is the basis of lasting happiness, then earning money will not play a big role, and such a person will act accordingly. So it is the ideas a person has that govern his behavior, that rule his life. So that also means, and in doing that we give a first answer to the question of the title of this talk, that when somebody changes ideas, then they change themselves. They change also their lives. And if we magnify this individual case to a mass of people, to a nation, or the world population, should we not conclude that in fact the same applies there? Also what humanity wants, how humanity organizes society, comes from how humanity thinks, how the average human being living on this planet Earth thinks. I say the average human being, but actually there is no such thing. We are all different. So we certainly don't all think the same, although a general characteristic can often be observed in our thinking. More about that later. Because of that characteristic, we often come to oppose one another, seeing the other as a competitor or enemy. This is easy to recognize in world events. Groups of people, nations face each other. Just think of the many, many wars that have been fought and will and are still being fought. It is all the result of the ideas we all cherish. What actually is an idea? The word has its origin in two Greek words, or rather it is derived from a Greek root, vid, and vid means both to see and to know. Vidya in Sanskrit also means wisdom, and videre in Latin means to see. The two Greek words derived from vid are eidos and idea. Plato uses both words where idea has a slightly deeper meaning, such as that you see behind things. And that's why it's also translated as notion or concept, or a notion based on insight. Anyway, when we talk about idea, apparently you see something, you see an image. And of course, you don't see it with your physical eyes. You perceive it with that what you might call a transcendental sense, your thinking, your mind, your thinking capacity. And therefore, an idea is a thought image. And consider that image to be meant literally. Look, when I say to you, think of a car or think of a house, but also when I say think of war or peace, you see something. Maybe when I say the word car, some people may think of a modern Tesla and others of an old Ford, but you see something. And although what we see, or rather what our mind perceives, will usually be very similar to that of others, especially when thinking about a car, but there will certainly be differences as well. There are probably 8 billion different thoughts, the thought of a car. Well, an idea could be called a coherent picture of some thoughts. And moreover, an ideal is a picture as well. The word ideal is derived from idea and has therefore the same etymological origin. So it's a thought image too. You see, as it were, the future. Or rather, you see what you would want the future to look like if you could shape it. In other words, it is an idea that you would like to see realized in the future. An ideal too is made of a few thoughts. And like an idea, it's an image, something you perceive, something your mind can perceive. It consists of some coherent thoughts. And that ideal can be either personal or impersonal. In the first case, it relates to your own wishes and desires. You may have an ideal of finding a good partner and starting a family, or be a successful person in your career. But your ideal may also be a world of peace and harmony. Anyway, the ideal is again made up of thoughts. The next question naturally that naturally arises is, what are thoughts? The question that is also asked in our course Thinking Differently, and that question is answered in that course, or rather we give some clues and the students have to find the answers themselves. Actually, it is curious that so little thought is given to what thoughts are, even though no one can deny that a person thinks thoughts all day long. According to Wikipedia, the term thought refers to the mental states or systems of ideas brought about by processes of thinking. And the Wikipedia in Dutch states that a thought is a moment in an ever ongoing process of thinking. Those statements in themselves are true, of course, but it does not explain what a thought is. That a thought has anything to do with thinking is obvious, but what is it? Materialists assume that thoughts originate in our brain, but how that process is supposed to happen, they don't know. And according to us, one would never come to know anything about it because thoughts do not originate in the brain, although the brain does play or can play a role in the thought process. Thoughts, Theosophical teaches, are living beings, very unconscious beings, it must be said, but nevertheless, they are living beings and they fulfill all the characteristics of life, such as they can die and be born, have a character of their own, can reproduce. However, you should not think of living beings as humans or animals, nor even plants or minerals. They are very primitive beings who are entirely dependent on us humans for their existence, for their manifestation. All thoughts are essentially elemental beings, so even less evolved than minerals, but nevertheless learning entities, which, like us human beings, will evolve more and more. Like any entity, a thought has a form, a body, a vehicle. In other words, thought energy is surrounded by a thought form, is embodied in a thought form, but the thought itself is an elementary energy. Maybe it's hard to imagine, but if you want to compare thoughts to something, you can do it with atoms or elementary particles who strictly follow the laws of nature without, or perhaps I should say almost without, composing it with the will. Compare it to iron filings attracted by a magnet. Well, people are like magnets, but they do not attract iron, but they attract thoughts. Now, magnets have two poles. They attract and they repel. So do people with thoughts. Depending on how your character is, you attract and repel thoughts. For example, if you are interested in the environment and global warming, you will attract thoughts on this subject. And if you are much in favor of vegetarianism, you will especially attract those thoughts. In this respect, social media such as Twitter and Facebook completely correspond to this. You create your own bubble. You only expose yourself to those thoughts that correspond to your character. Now, humans are complex and composite beings. There are different layers, different forces active in them, as we showed you in the first lecture. And therefore, almost no one will be so one-sided that they will never catch those other thoughts. So if you are a vegetarian, you will see and read and maybe try meatless food recipes from the newspapers, and the ardent meat lovers do not even see those recipes. Who easily catches a thought that is contrary to what you yourself think? However, sometimes when they are flipping through the newspaper, their eye may fall on one of those vegetarian ads, but they probably do not pay attention to those ads, so that the thought will stay for them for just a little while, and then they forget it. In other words, if you do not feed thoughts, that is, direct your attention to them, they die off. They find no permanent residence in your consciousness. If someone has inadvertently tuned in to this lecture at home and shrugs his shoulders when hearing that thoughts are living beings, and he pays no attention to it, then very rapidly he will forget this thought. And that person is focused on something else. He's tuned into another frequency. To make this idea clear, we always use the image of a human being as a transmitter and a receiver of thoughts. Just like a radio transmitter, which at the same time is a receiver of vibrations of radio waves. The frequency with which we transmit also determines what thoughts we receive. So when you are very selfless, compassionate, and humane, you will receive thoughts of that characteristic and not, for example, thoughts of hate and retribution. And again, the reverse is also true. In short, your own character determines the scope, the frequency range of your thinking. Don't expect to catch a philosophical thought if you are not interested in philosophy. And if you love football, then you will absorb all football news almost automatically. Well, our character is also the result of thoughts. Just check for yourself. A character is actually the collective habit patterns you have built up. And habits are nothing but repeated actions. And underlying an action is a thought. By the way, also underlying a non-action. And therefore, in our course Thinking Differently, we use the axiom: you saw a thought and you reap an action, you saw an action, you reap a habit, and you saw a habit and you reap a character. And if you think a little deeper about this axiom, you also understand that character reform is indeed possible, contrary to what some say. Only you should not start at the level of habits or actions, but at the level of thoughts. For thoughts, like all living beings, return cyclically to the one who thinks such a thought. The interval may be long. For example, people always think certain thoughts around Christmas time, which recur every year. So these typical thoughts come back at the 1 year interval. And with the first beautiful day in spring, you see something similar. But someone who quits smoking will find the thought of a cigarette comes back just about every minute, or at least it may come back. Now, if such a thought comes back and you want to get rid of it, you must first make a self-analysis, of course, of your own thinking, of your own mind. Then you must immediately think a thought of an opposite character. Then what happens? Well, the first thought will be deprived of its nourishment, while the second thought will be nourished. And when that first thought returns, the second will be coupled to it, just like behind the train, the carriage is coupled. And then again, Give that second thought your attention. That is energy, that is food for the thought. And the first thought becomes a little weaker again. And the second, a little stronger. When a thought is deeply ingrained in your consciousness, it's a tough guy, full of power, then the process of getting rid of that thought might sometimes take a lot of strength and a lot of time. After all, over many, many years, perhaps many lives, you have nurtured that thought and thereby made it strong. It seems like a part of yourself. It's familiar to you. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita, thoughts are represented as family, as cousins, as uncles, as teachers. That is how familiar you are with them. But it is possible to get rid of them, if only every time they come by, every time they come to visit you, put a thought of an opposite characteristic against them. And the interesting thing is that this also happens spontaneously. For instance, people who stop smoking, but then start snacking. Every time the thought of that cigarette is drawn to them, they eat the candy. The thought of the cigarette is replaced by the thought of chocolate or cookies. Then you haven't made much progress you may say, but when the thought of that cigarette comes along, you can also think a thought like, human happiness is determined by clear vision and by health, or any other positive thought. No negative thoughts, so rather don't say what you don't want, but replace the thought of a cigarette with something positive and persevere. Also in this case, the addiction of smoking will stop in the end, because as long as you keep giving more attention to those other thoughts, the thoughts of cigarettes will no longer receive nourishment, and as a result, you will find yourself in a very, very different life circumstances. So in all these individual cases, thoughts determine not only the character of a human being, but also the circumstances in which they live. And in fact, we can extend the action, thought, action, habit, character by saying, sowing a character, you reap karma, or you reap the conditions of your life. You reap your own destiny, your self-made destiny, your future reincarnation. We just said that an idea is actually a current collection of thoughts. So your own ideas about life, about what you think is right and wrong about life and death, the meaning of life, and so on and so forth, all those things rule in your own individual life. You are what your thoughts make of you. Your thoughts, your ideas color your life, determine your life. And what applies to an individual also applies to collectives, to cities, to countries, to civilizations. We will continue with that after the break. But first we have a break of 3 minutes, and you can ask your questions using the chat function or email. And after the break, we will try to answer your questions and then go on with part 2 and then part 3. So there's now a break of 3 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Astrid, are there some questions?
Yes, we do have a number of questions. The first one is about thoughts that are living beings. And the question is, do you build some kind of a relationship or cooperation with the beings that make up your ideal, for example?
Yes, you do. You know, in one way you may say that thoughts are your children or your grandchildren, but they belong to you. You feed them or you don't feed them, and if you don't feed them, they will go away. But there is a relationship between them, just like there is a relationship between the cells of your body and your mind. You are consciousness, everything is consciousness. So in your consciousness, you make you cooperate with a lot of beings, and you cooperate with those beings that we call, in our human language, thoughts, very primitive beings, but without those beings, you cannot think. So there is a relationship, of course, between them. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the second part of the question is, so when you're contemplating a thought, you said you create a form of that thought, but surely a thought also possesses free will. How does that work?
Well, the free will of any being depends on the consciousness range. So the greater the consciousness, the greater the free will. So compared to human beings, animals have just a little free will. And we have our mind, we can choose. But compared to plants, animals has already a greater free will. So in our mind, we may say plants don't have free will, but they have a little bit of free will. And minerals, which are on the hierarchy just less evolved than plants, still lesser free will than plants, and so on. So, you know, in our conception, you may not say that thoughts have free will. We are the master. We should be the master. We should lead the thoughts. But there are cases when we don't control our thinking, that a thought may possess us. Yeah, and you know those cases when people are inclined to do something they actually don't want to do because there is a thought in their mind and they can possess it. It's a story of Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. They are possessed by a thought, but that's because they didn't control their mind, and in a way they let the thoughts take control of their mind. So actually, if there is a sound situation, a man or a woman is the master of his thoughts, but if he doesn't control his mind and doesn't control his consciousness, then a thought or an idea can control a human being, which in fact is not a natural situation. I think the same happens with the cells of your body. If the situation is sound and there is a harmonic situation, the cells of your body don't elaborate their free will in such a way that you get ill. Cancer is a disease in which the free will of the cells is not controlled by a human being, so they are growing and growing from tumors. And in fact, that's not a natural situation, but it may happen. Well, the same may happen in our mind, that thoughts are expressing their free will without the control of the human being. But again, this is not a natural situation. And that's why we always say, control your thinking, control your thinking. And the second part of the thought, I'm going to say something about it.
And in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that sometimes a ruler suppresses the thoughts of the people. You mentioned, okay, if you don't feed an idea, a thought, then it dies. But what if you suppress it? Is that the same?
Well, I didn't say that the ruler suppresses the thoughts of the people, because he cannot.
Okay.
But he suppresses, at least I wanted to say, he suppresses the will of the people. Something you see in Iran now. Yeah. You see that the people want, at least as far as I can judge, that the people want another kind of land than the land they're living in now. Yeah, they want to be free, they want to express themselves. The women want to show their hair and all those kind of things. They want to think what they want. And the rulers try to suppress that, but they will always lose, because you can't not suppress the will of the people. And if they are wise rulers, they will change the policy, because at the end they will lose. and now they will lose after many, many, many deaths and many, many sufferings. So that's not really a good idea, because you cannot control the minds of others. You can control it in a way by hypnotizing, but only if the people don't control their own minds. Mm-hmm. So if a human being is self-controlled, is harmonious, nobody can control his thoughts.
Okay, there's another question that somebody asked. I hear often talking about a thought form. What is that?
Yeah, well, in a way, we call, there's an elementary being that the moment it appears at the horizon of our consciousness, we call it a thought. And the moment that we use, or we use is not the word, we cooperate with that elementary being to be able to think. So we give kind of manifestation to that being. Yeah, in fact, it's the same as, let me compare it again with the atoms of the cells of our body. We create a kind of field from our consciousness in which all those atoms and cells and organs of our body can manifest themselves. Oh, that's on a physical plane. We create a kind of field, you may say, a conscious field, depending on our character, in which those thoughts and ideas may manifest themselves. And they manifest in our consciousness, in our sphere, in our human sphere. So if I am a compassionate man, and now my sphere, the sphere around me, is compassionate as well, and those thoughts that belong to that sphere, he has the same character, can manifest themselves in that sphere. And that's when that happens, we say, I'm thinking a kind of thought. And when we are thinking that thought, we give manifestation to that thought, so we give shape to that thought. And when we do that, there is, of course, in relation with our brain, and the brain is, you may say, kind of you compare it with an antenna. Antenna is an English word.
Antenna.
Antenna, and that, but the brain is not really the organ that thinks. It's more, it's our mind, our consciousness, our thinking consciousness that is perceiving those thoughts. And there is, of course, a relationship then with the body and with the brain, but it's our mind that gives form, that gives shape to that very primitive being. And the moment that happens, we are talking about a thought. It's a very complex idea, especially when you hear it for the first time. In our course, Thinking Differently, there are various lessons when we talk about it, and there are a lot of questions about it. I know. Yeah.
There's another question that is, could you say that thoughts travel?
They travel within us. They travel within us, you may say. And of course, the moment I think a thought, I emit a thought as well. But in fact, I emit an energy, and another human being may perceive that energy and give that energy form in his consciousness. So you may say he make a copy of it in his consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so we spread thoughts. I'm going to say about that also something in the second part. So okay. Yes, there is no standstill, everything moves, and thoughts are also growing. Just like we are moving in the universe, because the planet Earth turns around the sun, and the sun turns around the black hole in our galaxy. We are moving every day, we're changing every day. In the same sense, you may say that the thought is traveling in us, within us.
The last question is, in the light of boundlessness and infinity, have we in our evolution also been a thought being?
Well, that's a very intuitive question. Yes, we have been a thought many, I can even say years, but we call it Manvantaras, that's many lives of the planet Earth ago, we were in fact beings like thoughts nowadays. And I will say something very, something you can ponder on for hours, because we are the thoughts of divine beings, of the gods. That's to say, we fulfill the same role, the same function we have in relationship with beings who are much more advanced than we are, the gods, as thoughts function in our consciousness. There's the same kind of relationship. So yes, we were thoughts long ago, and the thoughts who are now thoughts in the future, in the far future, will be human beings, and so on.
Okay, that's it.
That's it. Well, thank you. Well, then we go back. Now we go on with part 2. We hope to